Back to the deep dive. Today, our mission is pretty ambitious. We've got a formidable stack of source material in front of us.
A big stack.
It really is. It spans constitutional law, some really deep political philosophy, and even cutting-edge urban design.
And we're going to try and bring it all together.
Exactly. We're going to use it to construct a foundational defense strategy, specifically a three-pronged integrated strategy against the potential emergence of what the sources call a totalizing state.
Right. And that could manifest as, traditional totalitarianism, or maybe something a bit more subtle, more insidious, the technocratic regime.
So this deep dive is really aimed squarely at that question. Can the knowledge we have today actually equip us to resist a modern state that wants to control not just what we do, but our very identity, our context?
And the sources are, they're pretty unanimous that this modern totalizing force thrives on three specific interwoven pillars. They're designed to dismantle the free individual.
Okay, before we go another inch, let's define those. What are the three core vulnerabilities that the enemy, so to speak, exploits?
The first is alienation. The second is social isolation. And the third, and maybe the most modern, is unrestricted data collection.
Alienation, social isolation, and unrestricted data collection.
That's right. The total state in its contemporary form, whether it's run by algorithms or by ideology, it requires individuals to be fundamentally disconnected.
Disconnected from what exactly?
Disconnected from their community, disconnected from self-determination and from any sense of meaning, and crucially, disconnected from control over their own informational existence.
That's a huge point.
It is. So the core question for our analysis today is whether the mechanisms we're about to discuss can offer a structural counter mechanism to block this centralizing impulse.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the source material, it doesn't just present the problem, which is frankly terrifying. It also outlines a really comprehensive, integrated solution.
It does. It's a defense that has to be waged across three distinct domains of human experience.
So not just in one area. You have to fight it on all fronts.
Simultaneously. It has to be fought in the digital world, the physical world, and the spiritual world.
All right, so what's the first prong of that defense?
The first is juridical and digital sovereignty. This is about establishing rigid, uncompromising controls over data collection to counter that pillar of unrestricted data aggregation.
So the fight is for informational self-determination.
Precisely.
And the second prong?
That's the urbanistic and human scale defense. This is about the physical reconstruction of our cities. It's about designing our built environment for genuine human encounter and for natural community vigilance.
Which directly counters that threat of social isolation.
Exactly.
And the third, the anchor, as you called it.
And it is the indispensable anchor, philosophical and political pluralism. This reasserts the spiritual freedom and the inherent complexity of the individual.
And that's the direct structural counter to alienation and ideological homogenization.
That's it. This isn't just a theoretical framework, The source is presented as a tactical guide, a guide to structuring a free political existence in the face of all these converging pressures.
So let's start where the threat feels most immediate, right? The digital realm, the speed of technological evolution there is just staggering.
It is. We are deep in the network society. And the sources, they introduce this concept of the Orwell effect as it applies today.
The Orwell effect? That sounds ominous.
It is. It's the phenomenon where individuals are constantly, almost unconsciously, exchanging fundamental rights, especially privacy, in this sort of Faustian bargain for access to services and products.
So I give you my data, you give me a free email account or social media feed.
That's the transaction. And that transactional approach is exactly what fuels what Professor Shoshana Zuboff termed the economy of surveillance.
Right.
And the consequence of that economy is, it's terrifyingly comprehensive. The individual is no longer just a physical being defined by their actions or their location.
What are they then?
Instead, they are continuously tracked, parsed, and evaluated by this colossal, never-ending stream of what the sources call informational magnitudes.
Informational magnitudes. That phrase, it really resonates. It sounds like a total redefinition of the self.
It is.
It's like our identity, our potential, our behavior, it's all being continuously mediated and controlled by data streams that we rarely, if ever, see or understand.
That's a critical observation. Because this informational flux is so constant and so massive, the old legal concept of privacy, the right to secrecy, the right to intimacy, it's just structurally insufficient.
So the old walls don't work anymore.
They can't. Privacy in its old sense was a solid static boundary, a line you didn't cross. But in a world where everything we do, every interaction generates data, those boundaries are porous, if they even exist at all.
So if that old definition of privacy is obsolete, how must it evolve to meet the needs of a free individual today?
It needs to evolve into two interlocking concepts. The first is a concept called extimity.
Extimity, the opposite of intimacy.
In a way, yes. It acknowledges the reality of modern life, where sharing what was formerly private is now a deliberate act. Think about social media, public digital forums.
So the law has to account for the fact that we are choosing to put information out there.
Exactly. It needs to deal with that intentional outward data flow. But far more importantly, we need the universal recognition of the right to informational self-determination.
Informational self-determination. So that's the individual's right to determine, to the greatest extent possible, exactly how their personal data is collected, how it's used, how it's processed and circulated.
That's it. You're moving the conversation from the impossibility of hiding, which is a lost cause,
to the necessity of controlling.
the necessity of controlling. It's the cornerstone of digital sovereignty. If you control the purpose and the flow of your data, you disrupt the central aggregation model that the technocratic state relies on.
But this is where the law struggles to keep up, right?
It's a constant battle.
So let's compare some of the legal instruments out there. We have pioneering frameworks like the EU's GDPR, and for comparison, maybe regimes like the Brazilian LGPD. How do the sources gauge their effectiveness as barriers?
Well, they're crucial first steps, but they really highlight the ongoing fight for legislative rigidity. GDPR, for instance, it mandates rigorous accountability through something called Data Protection Impact Assessments, or DPIAs.
Okay, DPIAs. For those of us who aren't in compliance or legal, what are they, and why are they a tool for sovereignty?
The DPIA is essentially a proactive risk assessment. Before a company or a state body processes data in a way that might be risky, let's say they're introducing a new AI-driven surveillance system in a city.
Okay.
They must detail the potential impact on fundamental rights and freedoms. They have to identify the measures needed to mitigate those risks.
So it forces transparency and accountability before the damage is done.
Exactly. It's a mechanism that structurally recognizes the individual's right to self-determination before a single byte of data is processed in that new way.
But the moment you introduce loopholes, I imagine that sovereignty starts to crack.
That's the critical component. The sources note that while the Brazilian LGPD is strong in principle, it leaves what they call a margin of interpretation regarding which security incidents, which data breaches, must be communicated to the data subject and the national authority.
And that ambiguity, that's the problem.
That ambiguity is exactly the lever that a powerful technocratic state or a corporation can use to withhold critical information, to maintain opacity, and therefore to maintain centralized control.
That margin of interpretation, it seems like it's designed to serve institutional inertia, not the individual's right to know what's happened with their own information.
Absolutely. And this need for zero tolerance legal rigidity is connected by the sources back to a deep legal and economic tradition of resisting central authority.
Oh, this is interesting. How so?
They specifically cite the work of Ludwig von Mises, particularly his classic critique, Governo Omnipotente, or omnipotent government, and its relevance in this specific modern context.
Right. Mises is famous for his focus on the economic failure of central planning. How does his critique of central planning translate into a critique of central data control?
Well, Mises' tradition inherently argues that centralized control over any complex, dynamic system like an economy or, a society's information flow is inherently problematic.
Why? Because they can't know everything.
Precisely. The central authority can never process enough localized, granular, real-time knowledge to make effective, rational decisions. It's an information problem. So when you apply that to personal data, the central aggregation of that data becomes a recipe for two things.
Okay, what's first?
First, catastrophic failure when the centralized data is compromised, or more likely, misinterpreted. And second,
The temptation for control.
an irresistible temptation for total political control. So rigidity in data law, from this perspective, isn't just about privacy. It's about protecting the necessary complexity and decentralization of human knowledge and action.
So we need legal frameworks that are uncompromising, that force power to respect individual informational sovereignty. But what if the technological architecture itself could resist that centralized control?
That's the next layer of the defense.
Let's move from law to the technology of the technocratic state, the so-called smart city.
Right. The smart city promises this utopian efficiency by integrating the Internet of Things, IoT, and AI into every single function of urban life. The traffic lights, the waste collection, the energy grid.
The peril, though, as the sources detail, is that this entire architecture is often built on a foundation of, well, core security flaws.
A shocking lack of confidentiality, integrity, and authentication.
So if the IoT is the neural network of this new city, and it's fundamentally insecure, the whole organism is vulnerable, what does that insecurity actually look like on the ground?
It looks like millions of tiny, cheap endpoints. The sensors, the smart meters, the public cameras, all disregarding basic authentication protocols.
So they're easy to hack.
Incredibly easy. They might use factory default passwords that are never changed. They might transmit data over unencrypted channels. Or they just, lack the computational power to handle robust security measures in the first place.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. Think about a simple street sensor that monitors traffic flow. If it's easily compromised because it has no real authentication, that data feed can be manipulated to create phantom traffic jams. Or worse, it can be used as an entry point into the wider municipal network. A backdoor.
So if a totalizing state wants to exert control, it doesn't even need to break into the central government mainframe. It just needs to exploit the weakest, cheapest sensor on the network.
That's the vulnerability. So what technical counter strategies do the sources propose to harden these endpoints?
Right. How do you fix that?
The consensus is pretty clear. Mandatory pervasive use of end-to-end encryption and an insistence on transparent, publicly auditable data usage policies.
But this brings us to a fascinating technical challenge, right?
It does. To truly enforce digital sovereignty, even the smallest, cheapest device must be cryptographically secure.
And this is where that resource constraint becomes a real factor. We're talking about devices like, passive RFID tags, simple microcontrollers, things with almost no power.
Precisely. We need robust public key encryption schemes. Things like elliptic curve cryptography or ECC, NetroEncrypt, Rabin scheme. But these schemes are computationally intensive. They require processing power.
Take ECC, for example. What's the challenge there?
Well, it offers very high security with relatively shorter keys compared to traditional RSA, which is great. But even that level of complexity can completely overwhelm a device that only has a few kilobytes of memory and minimal processing power.
And what about something like NetroEncrypt? I've heard that mentioned in the context of post-quantum security.
It is. It's lattice-based, often touted for post-quantum resistance. But implementing it still requires this very careful balancing of key size and the computational burden on these constrained devices. It's a huge engineering challenge.
So the defense strategy really hinges on a technological arms race against the device's own limitations. The weakest link isn't necessarily malicious intent, but just insufficient battery and processing power.
That's a critical constraint that system designers absolutely have to overcome. If we can't secure the periphery, this vast network of IoT sensors, then all the legal rigidity in the world will fail because the data will already be compromised or aggregated without proper consent at the lowest possible level.
This challenge leads us directly to the next stage of evolution, which the sources call Web 3.0, or the spatial web.
Right, and this is the convergence of everything we've just talked about. IoT, AI, virtual and augmented reality, VRR, and distributed ledgers like blockchain.
And we know Web 2.0 gave us the crisis of fake news. So if we project this exponential convergence forward, what is the ultimate threat of Web 3.0 as warned by the sources?
The threat is far, far graver than just misinformation. The sources warn that the crisis of Web 3.0 will be fake reality.
Fake reality.
We're talking about AI's staggering ability to generate entire, unique, and dynamically intelligent virtual environments, smart spaces, at a near infinite scale, perfectly tailored to an individual and fully interactive.
Fake reality implies that our ability to form a consensus truth, something anchored in a shared, verifiable experience, just vanishes.
It does. If the spatial and the digital world are perfectly manipulable by a centralized AI, then our very understanding of the world becomes precarious.
That's the definition of a global catastrophe risk.
It is. If this technology, which is incredibly potent for good, we should say, is harnessed without the right controls, it allows a totalizing power to manipulate spatial context and digital perception on a mass scale.
I mean, think about the implications of deepfake technology, but applied to an entire virtual environment where citizens meet, transact, business, and learn.
It's terrifying.
So if the technology creates this immense threat, how does the underlying architecture of Web 3.0 also provide the defense?
The key is its native principle of decentralization. Distributed ledger technology, the backbone of this evolution, is fundamentally poised to decentralize trust, money, and commerce.
So this is a structural move away from having giant centralized banking intermediaries and monolithic data centers.
Exactly. Away from those single points of failure and control.
So instead of trying to secure one central vault filled with everyone's data, the data and the trust in that data is distributed across a network,
making it inherently harder for any single entity, be it corporate or state, to aggregate it, manipulate it, or restrict access to the truth.
It's a structural solution.
Exactly. This structural decentralization, which fosters what you could call a network economy, is the most powerful systemic countermeasure to the centralized data control that the technocratic impulse requires.
So the fight for digital sovereignty starts with legal rigor, but it's ultimately won by a decentralized architecture that makes that kind of technological overreach structurally infeasible.
That's the argument.
That's fascinating. The strategy demands that we reject centralization at every single layer, legal, technological, and architectural. So the question for you, the professional listener, is how much of your data are you willing to fight to reclaim, and how are you leveraging decentralized platforms in your work today? All right, now we execute a pivot. We're going from the infinite digital frontier to the very finite, tangible space of our cities.
The big shift.
It is. The second pillar of the totalizing state is social isolation. And the sources argue that the modern metropolis hasn't just allowed isolation to happen, it has actively built it into the physical structure of our lives.
This is where we encounter this really startling phrase. The sources say the car-centric metropolis has created the totalitarian space of the modern urban condition.
That is a powerful condemnation.
It's a huge statement.
Yeah.
It describes urban planning that systematically prioritizes the flow, the velocity, and the storage of vehicles over the physical encounter and the well-being of the human beings who are actually living there.
It's a literal physical inequality of space that we've just accepted as normal. I mean, the sources mention areas where 70%, even up to 90% of circulation and conveyance space is dedicated exclusively to the needs of the automobile.
That's right. And the dominance of the car imposes this unjust and unequal appropriation of the public sphere. The street, which really should be the primary arena for political, social, and commercial life.
It gets diminished.
It's diminished to merely a place of rushed passage. The design alienates the resident from their own neighborhood by eliminating the very conditions necessary for spontaneous human interaction.
So this is the core urban problem then. The street loses its vital connection to the home, the domain of the private, and it becomes this chaotic, dangerous, or just empty corridor that's dominated by the private vehicle.
And that private vehicle is seen as the only viable solution to public transport problems, which just reinforces the cycle.
And that's precisely why the urbanistic defense has to begin by reversing this priority. We have to start with the scale of the human being.
This means we have to return to the foundational work of thinkers like Jan Gehl.
The Danish architect.
Yes. Gehl argued so persuasively that a truly successful city has to offer excellent opportunities for walking. It has to value what happens at the street level.
What does Gehl mean by valuing the street level?
He means designing for complexity and for interaction. Successful streets are not just pathways. They are spaces for a diversity of activities.
Like what?
Walking, of course, but also stopping, resting, observing, and crucially, social interaction. Gehl always emphasized that walking is the primary point of departure for all other human activities.
So if a city fails at the walking level,
It fails fundamentally as a human habitat.
here's where it gets really interesting for me. If the car-centric model fosters isolation and sterile fear, then the human-centric model, it seems, fosters community safety.
It does.
And this leads us directly to Jane Jacobs and her legendary concept of eyes on the street.
Jane Jacobs's work is really the quintessential urban defense against isolation. She argued that true security doesn't come from high fences or, constant technological surveillance.
It's not about more cameras.
No, it comes from continuous informal community vigilance, and that's fostered by diversity and density of use. The simple presence of diverse people, a baker opening his shop, a resident watching from a window, children playing in a square, that acts as a powerful, self-regulating security mechanism.
She fundamentally flipped the conventional wisdom of her time on its head. The idea back then was that order and emptiness guaranteed safety.
Absolutely. Jacobs argued that the abandonment or emptiness of public space does not guarantee safety. On the contrary, it breeds fear and it creates opportunity for crime. Life and movement are the security guarantee.
So for these eyes to work, what do you need?
Well, the sources detail some strict requirements. First, there must be a clear demarcation between public and private space, so people feel a sense of ownership and responsibility. Second, you need continuous utilization of sidewalks throughout the day, not just during rush hour. And third, you need sufficient density of movement and mixed uses, residential, commercial, social, baromatic, to sustain those eyes on the street at all hours.
I remember walking through a neighborhood where every building was set back behind these huge parking lots, and the sidewalks felt like they just led nowhere. It instantly made me feel isolated, not secure.
That feeling is the totalitarian space in action.
That's it.
That design actively discourages interaction and observation. And this emphasis on making the environment visible and controllable by residents and users, it ties directly into a major applied methodology. It's used by designers like Jamie Lerner, and it's been codified globally as CPT.
CPT crime prevention through environmental design.
That's it.
Let's dedicate some time to CPT because it feels like a really powerful practical tool for this urban defense. What are its core principles, and how does it implement Jacobs' ideas in design practice?
CPT is a very systematic approach. The first generation of it focused on four main elements that use the physical form of the built environment to reduce crime opportunities and to promote natural control.
Okay, walk us through those four.
First is natural access control. This uses physical features, things like landscaping, lighting, clearly marked entry points, to subtly guide people, both residents and visitors, toward appropriate entrances and pathways.
So it limits opportunities for hidden access. You shouldn't need a giant gate. The design itself should tell you where to go.
Exactly. The second is natural surveillance. This is all about maximizing visibility. It means avoiding blind corners, ensuring good lighting, and designing buildings with windows and balconies that look out onto public spaces. It's the literal eyes on the street principle in architectural form.
The more a resident can see, the less likely a potential offender is to act.
Right. The third is often overlooked, but it's absolutely crucial for sustained safety.
And that is
territorial reinforcement. This is all about creating a sense of ownership. Using features like distinctive paving, low fences, public art, or well-maintained gardens to clearly delineate public space from semi-private space.
It sends a message.
It sends a clear message. This area is owned, cared for, and monitored by the people who live here.
And finally, the ongoing responsibility.
Maintenance. A well-maintained space signals that the community is vigilant and cares. Neglect signals abandonment, and that invites disorder. These principles directly counter social isolation by making community ownership tangible and visible.
Now, moving beyond just security, there's this immense public health imperative. I mean, the sedentary, car-centric lifestyle is quite literally killing us.
The sources quantify this beautifully. We are seeing major health crises, obesity, heart disease, diabetes, all driven by our dependence on cars.
It's a design problem.
It is. A global shift toward active transport, like walking and cycling, combined with quality public transit, isn't just environmentally sound. It's a public health necessity that could mitigate millions of annual deaths globally. That includes the massive toll taken by physical inactivity and also ambient air pollution.
So designing for the human scale is genuinely life-saving. How do we measure if we're actually succeeding? This is where concepts like the Walkability Index or comminability come in.
Exactly. The Walkability Index assesses the quality of the urban environment to stimulate pedestrian movement. And it goes beyond just simple metrics.
How so?
For instance, the sources detail the necessary rigor found in São Paulo's sidewalk law. It's really specific. It divides the sidewalk into 3 mandated bands.
Okay.
You have the service band for infrastructure like trees and ramps. Then the free circulation band, which is the pedestrian path. And it has a crucial minimum width of 1.20 meters.
Why is that specific width so important?
So that 2 people can pass comfortably, or a wheelchair can maneuver without obstruction. It's about accessibility and dignity. And then the third is the access band right next to the property.
That attention to detail, the 1.20 meter minimum, that's what separates functional urbanism from dysfunctional urbanism.
Absolutely. And beyond the structural integrity and the paving, the index also considers the density and diversity of services. Near key transit hubs, like the Conceição subway station in São Paulo, the high concentration of diverse offerings, shops, schools, banks, it reinforces pedestrian flux.
People are walking because they have to, and they're doing it efficiently.
And that functional movement when it's channeled appropriately, directly enhances natural surveillance and safety. It all connects.
Now let's pull back to the community scale with social urbanism. This is where architecture becomes a tool for actively repairing the social contract, for countering isolation through major public investment.
The examples from cities like Medellin in Colombia are globally recognized for this. They use strategic public works, what they call anchor equipment, grandes equipamentos públicos.
So big public facilities.
Yes, major cultural centers, educational complexes, beautiful libraries. And they connected them using sophisticated mobility systems like the metro cable into marginalized, high vulnerability hillside communities.
The genius there wasn't just building a library, it was situating it strategically to integrate a formerly isolated community into the economic and social fabric of the city using those mobility systems.
Precisely. The goal of these utopias, as some of the community centers were called, was to offer high-quality, free public infrastructure that generated genuine places of encounter, of well-being, and of pride.
It's a high-impact commitment.
It is. It promoted the fundamental reconstruction of the social fabric and community cohesion. It was urbanism used as a tool for radical social inclusion.
But these huge projects, they often fail without sustained community involvement. How do the sources emphasize the necessary role of participation and testing?
They emphasize that successful interventions, like the Process de Paz project, require intense, sustained community mobilization. This isn't just about showing up for a ribbon-cutting ceremony.
It's more than that.
It means involving residents right from the initial diagnosis, identifying which corners feel unsafe to different demographics, all the way through planning, execution, and continued co-management of the space.
So you're essentially turning residents into co-responsible urban managers.
That's a powerful distinction, yes. And the fastest way to test these complex human-scale solutions is through something called tactical urbanism.
Right, temporary intervention.
Exactly. Temporary low-cost interventions using paint, planters, temporary furniture to rapidly test out changes to traffic flow or create pedestrian zones or just new place-making ideas.
So it democratizes the design process.
It does. It allows citizens to tangibly experience and challenge the status quo from the very earliest phases. And that ensures the final permanent works truly serve the human scale and actively counter isolation.
So we've established our defenses in the digital and the physical domains. Now we arrive at what feels like the deepest and most crucial defense, the ideological and spiritual front.
It is the foundation.
The total state, whether it's old school totalitarian or this new era technocratic version, it fundamentally relies on flattening human existence into a single controllable definition. Alienation is the final result of that process.
This is where we have to anchor our defense in political philosophy. And we're drawing heavily on Eric Voegelin's monumental analysis of the total state.
Voegelin saw totalitarianism not just as a political error, but as something much deeper.
As a spiritual catastrophe.
Yeah.
He specifically studied figures like Mussolini and Gentile, who demanded the total mobilization of society under the state.
So what was the structural, the intellectual flaw that Voegelin identified that allows this total state to emerge in the first place?
His core critique was targeted at legal positivism, particularly figures like Hans Kelsen. Voegelin argued that reducing the phenomenon of the state to a mere object of law, just a set of functions and norms, ignoring its historical and spiritual context, is fatal.
Why? What does that ignore?
Positivism ignores the accessible essence of being, of man and society. That essence, which is constituted prior to science, by human action, by morality, by spiritual aspiration.
So if you define the state as just a legal machine, you eliminate the very basis for questioning the legitimacy or the morality of its actions.
You do. The substantive political problems, justice, order, truth, they simply vanish because they can't be measured empirically by that system.
And that reductionism creates a deep metaphysical void.
Exactly. And this void is instantly filled by a profound spiritual sickness, which Voegelin termed the Gnostic revolt.
The Gnostic revolt?
The Gnostic, in his view, is characterized by the rejection of transcendent reality and the subsequent denial of the mystery of creation, the tension of living in an imperfect open world.
That sounds a little abstract. How does this Gnostic revolt actually manifest as totalitarian ideology in the real world?
The Gnostic impulse is the attempt to immanentize the eschaton.
To bring heaven to earth, basically.
To force a perfect, closed, utopian world within historical time, and by doing so, eliminating the spiritual uncertainty of human existence. The forces provide some chilling historical examples of this.
Okay, let's start with Auguste Comte.
Comte in his attempt to engineer a perfect social order, actually founded the religion of humanity. This was a deliberate effort to create a purely sociological god, the grand etre, or great being, by divinizing historical existence itself.
So he was trying to replace traditional religion?
Consciously. He excluded figures like Jesus Christ from his calendar of commemoration, striving to achieve a total mobilization of sentiment based purely on human, internal, and observable systems. It was a total rejection of any authority or mystery beyond his own sociological framework.
And what about the Marxist project, which influenced so many 20th century states? How does that fit in?
Vogelin views Marxism as a powerful, albeit secularized, mysticism. Its aim is to create the total individual, the self-sufficient subject who is free from the tension of being a creature.
Free from uncertainty.
The Marxist system forbids metaphysical questions because they disrupt the closed, deterministic world it proposes. The question Marx implicitly forbids is it possible to deny God and maintain reason?
And by banning that question,
by collapsing all spiritual inquiry into economic determinism, the system destroys the order of the soul. And it creates the alienated subject who is now ready for total mobilization by the state.
So whether you're talking about the fascist state's demand for total devotion or the communist state's demand for total submission to historical determinism, the underlying cause is the same.
A spiritual crisis that results in ideological homogenization. And this naturally leads to massive individual alienation.
It does. And this is why the philosophical response has to pivot away from purely structural political analysis and towards something like existential psychology, where the individual rebuilds their own internal defense.
The individual response to alienation, to isolation, to lack of meaning, that is the most crucial layer of defense.
And this is where Viktor Frankl and his logotherapy step in, addressing the despair over the apparent absence of meaning in existence, a despair that's often exacerbated by the feeling of being just a cog in a large, meaningless state machine.
Frankl's contribution is foundational because he warned against something he called pathologism.
Pathologism.
The dangerous tendency of modern society to classify healthy spiritual distress, the fundamental human search for meaning, as a pathological symptom that needs to be medically eliminated.
So feeling lost isn't a disease.
Frankl insisted that the human being is fundamentally distinguished by their concern with meaning. This spiritual tension is not a weakness, it's a necessary human state. We have to resist the pressure to medicalize or institutionalize our deepest existential questions.
But wait, if he argues the search for meaning is fundamentally human, how do we distinguish that healthy tension from, say, genuine clinical depression that does require treatment? That seems like a very thin line to walk.
That's a point of necessary nuance. Frankl's work doesn't negate the need for clinical treatment for true chemical imbalance or profound psychological disorder. Of course not.
Okay.
Instead, it challenges the cultural tendency to categorize all existential malaise, that sense of unfulfilled potential or uncertainty about life's purpose, as a disorder that can be cured by external means.
So the healthy spiritual tension is a driver for meaning.
It's a driver, not a debilitating symptom. It forces a confrontation with reality, which is exactly what the totalizing state wants to suppress.
So how does logotherapy transform this existential tension into an active protective defense mechanism against that flattening effect of ideology?
By recognizing the transitoriness of life as an imperative for radical responsibility, Frankl explained that the only transient aspects of life are possibilities. They vanish if we don't seize them.
Okay.
But once a possibility is realized, a piece of work done, a love experienced, or most profoundly suffering endured with bravery, that reality is irrevocably guarded in the past. It's safe from transitoriness.
That concept, the past, as a guarded resource of meaning, that is incredibly powerful.
It's the ultimate form of self-determination. The sum of your past actions, your achievements, your ethical decisions. It forms a permanent, unassailable core of meaning.
So the totalizing state can imprison you, it can destroy your present life, but it can never seize or homogenize the irrevocable meaning you have already created.
That is the philosophical anchor.
And this principle of non-homogenization, it has to extend into the political sphere, the absolute necessity of pluralism and healthy tension.
This political refusal of forced homogeneity was championed globally, including by the progressive Catholic movement that's highlighted in the sources. We're talking figures like Jacques Maritain, Louis-Joseph Lepre, and Dom Helder Camara.
And they advocated for humanismo integral humanism.
Yes.
What distinguished integral humanism from other movements that were also advocating for social change at the time?
Their emphasis was not just on structural change. agrarian or urban reform. But crucially, that change had to come through a prior change in mentalities.
So change the person first.
Their goal was to democratize society and pursue the integral human development of the whole man and all man, de homo dos do ide todos os homens. This focus on the whole man directly counters the totalizing pressure to reduce a human being to a mere function of the state, or the economy, or an algorithm.
The moment you demand the whole man, you are demanding complexity, plurality, and a refusal to be defined by a single utility.
And that complexity must be maintained spatially in the city. The defense against the total state demands that we maintain the city and the political sphere as a space of healthy tension between the individual and society.
The healthy tension.
This healthy tension, which avoids the ideological closure of the Gnostic revolt, is reflected in the demand for the communication of consciences.
What does that mean?
The genuine encounter of men in their essential plurality. This required dialogue, and the inevitable friction that comes with it is the fundamental exigency for historical realization. It counters the determinism that totalitarian ideologies rely upon.
So the philosophical defense at its core is simply refusing the comfortable lie of a single, easy answer. It's about embracing complexity.
That's it.
And that continuous dialogue, that demand for encounter, that's precisely what brings us right back to Jane Jacobs' street corner, where different views and different lives are forced to interact daily, creating that healthy tension in physical space.
It's a perfect connection.
Yeah.
The philosophical anchor is what gives purpose to the digital defense, and it gives meaning to the urban reconstruction.
This has been a truly integrated and I think a really necessary deep dive. We started with the foundational analysis of the totalizing threat, which relies on alienation, social isolation, and unrestricted data collection.
And we end with a threefold structural defense strategy, one that has to be waged simultaneously across all levels of existence.
So to summarize the three prongs, first, digital sovereignty, demanding rigid legal frameworks like DPIAs and technologically decentralized architecture like Web 3.0.
To ensure the individual owns their informational magnitudes and to prevent the rise of fake reality.
Second, human-scale cities. Reversing the totalitarian space that was imposed by the automobile, this involves using principles from Gale, from Jacobs, CP-TED, alongside strategic social urbanism.
To actively reconstruct the social fabric and community vigilance, making the physical world a place of encounter, not a place of isolation.
And third, the indispensable philosophical anchor.
This is the spiritual defense drawn from Voegelin's rejection of Gnosticism and Frankel's logotherapy. It asserts that the meaning-seeking individual, grounded in their own irrevocably guarded past and living in a space of healthy pluralistic tension, is fundamentally resilient to ideological totalization.
The profound lesson here is that the fight for freedom isn't passive. It requires deliberate construction. We have to actively build spaces, physical, digital, and ideological, that affirm the complexity, the value, and the dignity of the plural meaning-seeking individual.
And this final thought, it ties back to history and political philosophy. The sources reference Thomas Aquinas, who envisioned a free, self-governing society built upon two essential pillars: free proprietors and engaged citizens participating in government.
In our emerging reality, this spatial web, where the digital and the physical worlds are merging, that concept of proprietorship has to evolve dramatically.
Indeed. The ultimate question for you, the professional citizen, is this: what new enforceable forms of proprietorship of data, proprietorship of urban space, and crucially, proprietorship of existential meaning, must we establish today to secure the political existence and the fundamental freedom of the citizen tomorrow?
Something profound to ponder on your next walk, hopefully one through a bustling, well-designed public square.
Absolutely. Until next time, keep demanding depth and clarity.